Welcome back. This is our World History 2 SOL 13 lecture, and we're talking about the origins of the Cold War. All right. Think back to World War One, back to the Bolshevik Revolution, where we already started to see sort of an alignment, by the U.S. and its Western allies against the communists. Okay, so competition between the United States and the USSR is at the core of the Cold War conflict. Now let's build on that a little bit. So the Cold War influenced politics, policies of the United States, foreign policy, domestic policy of the United States and the USSR toward other nations and conflicts around the world. Not just foreign policy, but domestic policy. We're going to see how things happen within the United States that are really significant, good and bad as a result of the Cold War. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. All right. It's a war of words, you could say. It's fought with words and ideas. It's a war of ideologies, as in, capitalist democracies versus communist dictatorships. But there is bloodshed, and there are deadly weapons employed. The United States and the Soviet Union don't necessarily face each other head on militarily, and there are a few incidents where U.S. and Russian forces do shoot at each other, but those are not acknowledged. Okay. And for the most part, they fight what are called proxy wars. So we're going to see war in Korea. We're going to see war in Vietnam. We're going to see war in Afghanistan. We're going to see conflict all around the world as a result of the ongoing Cold War conflict, and many people will die. So it's a Cold War only in the sense that the United States and Soviet Union are not directly and openly fighting each other militarily, mainly because they can't. More on that in a moment. So after World War II, you've got two superpowers, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Western democracies, Eastern communist states. Okay, I think we've established that by now. So a rift is formed. The United States and its Western allies, NATO, versus the Soviet Union and its Eastern allies, the Warsaw Pact. So you could mark 1945 to 1948 as the beginning of the Cold War, but check it out. I mean, the seeds of the Cold War were sown before World War II ended. When Russian troops and American troops met face to face at the Elbe River, having just conquered their Nazi enemy, they were already Cold War adversaries. The battle lines had already been drawn. Stalin already had spies in America's nuclear program. The United States told Britain about its nuclear program, but not Stalin, and was actively plotting against Stalin in the post-World War world. So the conflict was already there during World War II, really even before. Okay, so the Yalta Conference, the Soviets are given control of Eastern Europe. This means that what kind of government do you think is going to be in control in that part of the world? And this is Yalta right here. You see FDR, see Churchill, there's Joseph Stalin, okay? And so that means Eastern Europe is going to be predominantly communist, you guessed it. Stalin spreads communism to the satellite nations of the USSR. He does not hold free elections as he promised. So Soviet satellites are those satellite states, satellite nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. They're satellite states of the Soviet Union, like a satellite goes around something. Okay, I'm not doodling. You get the idea. This is the stated goal of the Soviet Union. In the early days of the Cold War, a kind of minor foreign embassy worker named George Kennan sends what's called the long telegram in response to a request for information by U.S. foreign policymakers. And he basically says, it's the goal of the Soviet Union to spread communism the world over. Therefore, it must be the goal of the United States to check communism the world over. And so begins the Cold War. And so begins the American policy of containment, containing the spread of communism. All right, and it's going to be 5 decades of that. Truman adopts this policy of containment recommended by George Kennan. And so the idea is we're not going to directly fight communism and go to war with the Soviets, mainly because it would be too destructive. The Soviets explode their first nuclear device in 1949. And so any direct conflict with the Soviet Union is going to result in most likely nuclear war. So they can't go to war directly with each other. So the policy is to prevent the spread, the expansion of communism, form alliances with weak countries, resist Soviet advances. This is the Truman Doctrine, which means contain communism, support countries that reject communism, prevent the spread of communism. All right. See, stop communism. It's everybody's job. You got to contain it, stop it from spreading. Okay. So Churchill makes a famous speech in which he says that across the ancient states of Europe, an iron curtain has descended. And behind the curtain is the Soviet Union. Churchill's term for the division that fell in Europe with democracy in the West and Soviet control in the East. So the Iron Curtain becomes a symbol of communism and the fear that accompanied it. Was it really an Iron Curtain? To a certain extent, yes, but some of it was largely imaginary. So, for example, later on, what we're going to see is the United States established normal relations with some communist countries like Yugoslavia and like China. So that Iron Curtain really isn't quite as iron as it's made out to be. All right, but here it is. Here's the cartoon I showed you guys in my last lecture. Here's Churchill. All right, by order of Joe, as in Joe Stalin. Okay. So the war escalates, and soon the world is divided into centers of power, Eastern and Western. The East is dominated by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the West is led by the United States. All right, so the United States represents democracy rather than free enterprise. Remember, we have a capitalist kind of mixed economy, and Soviets are dictatorships and have adopted communism. Okay. You can see here Stalin. This is a little cartoon of Stalin, Soviet Russia, and these are the Soviet satellites, right? And here's the West. Okay, country's not yet decided. It's as if to suggest that he's reaching out and trying to pull France into his sphere of influence. George Kennan says, and Truman says, if we don't contain communism, it will spread. All right, and there is some potential for that. The Iron Curtain again, made in Moscow. See, okay, I think you get the idea. So let's look at some events of the Cold War, and this is going to be very much a survey because I could teach an entire 2-semester class on the Cold War, and I have some recommended reading if you're interested about it. We're going to look at some of the big events in sort of a brief format. So remember that you have those two very important military alliances. You have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the U.S. and its Western allies, versus the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance between the Soviet Union and its allies. It's East versus West, communism versus democracy, red versus blue, whatever, however you want to term it. Okay. In 1949, thanks to a healthy spy network in the United States atomic program, the Soviet Union explodes its first atomic bomb. They had a ton of spies in our Los Alamos and other places. They had, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg sneaking schematics out in Jello boxes, and supposedly, and this, my understanding at least is that this is true, is that Stalin knew about the atomic bomb through spies before Harry Truman did. Harry Truman didn't find out about the bomb until FDR died and he became president. And so Stalin knew about the development of the bomb well before that and was racing to catch up. So the presence of nuclear weapons has influenced conflicts since then. If you have nuclear weapons, what do you have? You have a deterrent. All right. Nuclear weapons create a different sort of scenario. By the way, this is Kennedy and Khrushchev, who, we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's what I want you to consider. The United States and Soviet Union, sworn enemies, aligned against each other. Why don't they just fight it out? Why don't they just fight a war and it'll be over? How did they go for 5 decades without going to war with each other? Even when it came close, I mean, we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were close to fighting a war. There was a Prussian military officer. His name was Karl von Clausewitz. And Karl von Clausewitz was an observer during the Crimean War. And the Crimean War is one of the first modern wars, and it was a very bloody, destructive war. And von Clausewitz made a prediction. He said that wars are going to become so destructive that we won't fight them. Because when a war becomes so destructive that fighting the war pretty much destroys everything, there's no reason to fight the war. You fight a war to gain political power, territory, economic preeminence, whatever. But what if when you fight that war, you don't gain anything? In fact, you lose everything by fighting that war. What's the answer? You don't fight the war. So any war with the Soviets would be so destructive as to eliminate any gains. Basically, if the U.S. and the Soviet Union go to war with each other, they don't gain anything. They lose everything. So von Clausewitz, even writing from way back in the 1800s, was right. And we came close a couple times, but his words echo across time. He made a very good point, von Clausewitz. Keep von Clausewitz in mind, because that's going to be part of your discussion board. Okay, so one major event of the Cold War is the Korean War. So North Korea was communist. South Korea was democratic. The Soviet Union kind of gave support for North Korea to invade the South in the idea that they would unify the peninsula under one communist regime. The Soviets did this because they kind of thought that the United States didn't really care about South Korea, that it was outside of their sphere of influence. We really weren't going to do anything about it. Well, the Truman Doctrine says that we have to. We have to contain the spread of communism, even if South Korea at the time had very little strategic importance. All right, we still have to contain the spread of communism. So the United States, with the support of the United Nations, becomes involved. And under General Douglas MacArthur, they make a major landing at Pusan, and they push the North Koreans all the way back up to the Manchurian border at the Yalu River. And then the Chinese get involved. The Chinese send massive amounts of troops south and push the Americans and the South Koreans all the way back to the 38th. Let me erase. This is getting busy. Hang on a second. It's probably hard for you guys to see what the heck is going on. So with the Chinese, when the Chinese invade, they push the Americans back all the way to the 38th line of latitude, which will divide the Korean peninsula. Okay, so the 38th parallel becomes the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. The two Koreas don't actually sign a peace treaty. They sign an armistice, which is a ceasefire. So technically, they are still kind of at war with each other today, although that's kind of changing because recently they've talked about, enhancing that. There's been maybe some potential solution to that, but there's still this border today, and I've been there. The 38th parallel is known as the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. It's the most heavily fortified border on Earth. It is minefields and guard towers and razor wire, everything you can imagine. North Korea remains communist. South Korea remains a powerful democratic state and U.S. ally. And so technically these two Koreas have never ended this conflict. All right, North Korea remains communist. All right, fighting stabilized at the 38th parallel. The space race is another aspect of the Cold War. And the Soviets really strike the first blow with the first artificial satellite launch, Sputnik. Sputnik is Russian for fellow traveler. And they successfully put a satellite into orbit around the Earth and transmits a little beep as it goes around that you can hear from Earth-based stations. It's the first satellite put into Earth's orbit, beginning the space race. The space race is important because whoever can develop the technology to get into space and dominate space has a major technological and strategic advantage over the other. And so the United States is kind of late. The Soviets are going to score some major victories in the space race. This is the actual Sputnik satellite, okay? The Russians actually managed to put the first man in orbit too. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human to orbit the Earth. He takes off from Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. But we're going to quickly catch up. So the first American to orbit the Earth will be, oh, I clicked off John Glenn, and then with the development of our moon program, we will put a man on the moon first, and eventually the United States will emerge from the space race as the victor. This is largely because our sort of means of managing our economy, our sort of system of government allows for the free exchange of information. And so we're able to develop miniaturized computer technology. We're able to put out contracts. We're just able to develop the spacefaring technology quicker and more ably than the Soviets. The Bay of Pigs invasion is a failed invasion of communist Cuba. And so essentially, Fidel Castro overthrew Batista, who was sort of a very inhumane dictator in Cuba. Castro quickly becomes an enemy of the United States because, well, one, he's communist. And so we see this expansion of communism as counter to the Truman Doctrine, so we've got to get rid of him. He also nationalizes Cuban land. So he takes away lands from American fruit companies and gives them back to the Cuban people. And so the CIA gathers up a large number of Cuban exiles and trains them in Florida, and then equips them with some kind of World War II planes and tanks and things like that. And the idea is that they're going to land at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and that by doing that, they will spark a revolution against Fidel Castro. Well, here's the thing. They didn't have very good operational security. So by the time this thing happens, Fidel Castro has already known about it for a while, and he's kind of waiting on the beach for them to show up, and it's a disaster. The only thing is, it actually works out pretty good for the Kennedy administration, because a lot of people said that Kennedy was soft on communism, and they were like, hey, good job, you know, he's tough on communism. So it was actually kind of a political boost for him. So the U.S. did not support the exiles properly, namely in air support. They didn't provide them enough air support. The invasion was crushed. The exiles were imprisoned and tortured, and eventually they were traded to the U.S. All right, there's the Bay of Pigs right there where the invasion took place. All right, on Cuba. All right, the Berlin Wall goes up in 1961. It was constructed to separate East and West Berlin. Remember, the city of Berlin lies deep in the heart of communist East Germany. And here you can see, you know, Soviet conscripts quickly kind of building the wall, and eventually they're going to enhance it with large concrete dividers. And so, well, let me go back. So essentially they're doing this not to keep the West out. They're doing it to keep their people in. By the 1960s, West Germany is doing pretty good. Its economy is in recovery. Standard of living is coming up. And East Germany is not doing well. And so many East Germans are fleeing to the West. And many East Berliners are fleeing to West Berlin and jumping on trains and headed for West Germany. If you got to build a wall to keep your people from leaving, you're probably doing something wrong. This is going to become a symbol of, you know, Soviet sort of totalitarianism for a long time. It's going to come down in 1989. More on that later. All right. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as I've mentioned, is the closest the superpowers ever come to a nuclear exchange, as in nuking each other. Castro allows Soviets to put medium-range missiles in Cuba, which means that the Soviets can launch an attack on the United States with practically no warning. The United States had been overflying Cuba regularly with spy planes and taking aerial footage, and so they were able to say that there were medium ballistic missiles at various sites being assembled, and they were able to sort of track all of this. And so what is created is a precarious situation, because American military leaders advocate for a preemptive strike. They're telling Kennedy, we need to invade Cuba and destroy the missiles before they can become active and a threat to the United States before it's too late. And all of this, you had all of these military advisors, including LeMay, who's an Air Force general from World War II, advising Kennedy, attack, 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 send in an invasion force, strike first. And Kennedy resists that advice, and that's very fortunate. So the U.S. spy planes see missiles being built, and Kennedy, instead of going ahead with an invasion as is recommended by his military leaders, institutes a blockade. Okay, John F. Kennedy institutes a blockade. He blockades Cuba, basically surrounds it with naval vessels, and is restricting access to Cuba. And he makes an announcement. He goes on TV and he says, we know these nuclear weapons are in Cuba, and any attack launched from Cuba against any other country will be viewed as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. So Kennedy is telling the Soviet leader, who at this point is Nikita Khrushchev, if anything happens, you and I are going to war. All right? His military advisors are eager for an invasion, but Kennedy wants to wait and negotiate with Khrushchev for the missiles to be removed. There's a tense 13-day standoff. Some American aircraft are fired upon. You have Soviet submarines and ships in close proximity to American vessels. And so it's a recipe for disaster. At any moment, somebody could lose their nerve, a shooting war could start, and then the missiles will fly. But Kennedy was wise to institute this blockade and avoid an invasion. So Kennedy is working through intermediaries to negotiate with the Soviets. There's no direct line at this point. There's no way for Kennedy to just pick up the phone and talk directly to Nikita Khrushchev. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they will install just such a hotline because of how important they realize communication is. Ultimately, Khrushchev, who is, like I said, the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin, backs down. He agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. agrees to not invade Cuba, and also agrees rather to remove some Atlas nuclear missiles that we have based in Turkey. So we kind of privately, secretly remove missiles from Turkey. We publicly pledge not to invade Cuba. Khrushchev publicly removes the missiles from Cuba. The U.S. gets to keep a base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and it's still there today. But ultimately, this crisis is resolved, and communication between the two superpowers is improved via the installation of that hotline that I mentioned. Now, here's why it's a really good thing that Kennedy did not take the advice of his generals and invade Cuba. We found out in the 1990s, well, we kind of already knew that the Soviets had battlefield nukes. So they had medium-range ballistic missiles, but they also had short-range, what are called tactical nuclear weapons. These are like ones that you just lob across the battlefield, to like nuke a landing force. And so, like, if the Marines had hit the beaches of Cuba, they would have got nuked. All right, and you might say, oh well, Khrushchev might not have authorized the use of nuclear weapons. Here's the thing: we didn't know this until the 1990s. But unlike the United States, the Soviet commanders on the ground had discretion to use those tactical nuclear weapons. So like in the United States, only the president is allowed to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. Soviet military officers on the ground could have decided in that moment to use nukes, and they almost certainly would have, facing an American invasion force. If they had nuked the Marines, we would have nuked them back. Soviets would have nuked us, we would have nuked the Soviets, and the world as we know it would have come to an end. So we came really close to the edge with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Vietnam War is also an example of the Truman Doctrine in action. North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam, US-backed Democratic. One kind of controversial part of the Vietnam War was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Supposedly some US warships were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Turns out they weren't. It turns out they weren't. So it was just sort of concocted as an excuse to get involved. The United States is going to go to war with its South Vietnamese allies against the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese. What they're going to run into, though, is that the war is in South Vietnam. We're not going to take the war home to the North Vietnamese. It's a limited war. And the North Vietnamese are going to have Viet Cong allies who are not in uniforms, who can blend into the population, who can fight guerrilla warfare using ambushes and mines and traps. And this is unlike any war the United States has fought, except for when we did it to the British way back during the Revolution. And so the war is going to drag on and drag on without an end in sight. The Johnson administration lies to the American people and tells them that the war is going well. But then you get the Tet Offensive, and it just becomes obvious that the war is going to go on indefinitely. So American public opinion turns against the Vietnam War. Nixon gets elected and introduces a policy known as Vietnamization, in which he says, so we're going to pass off the war effort to our South Vietnamese allies and bring our troops home. North Vietnam, after the United States pulls out, invades the South, takes the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, and Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, wins. Now, the United States, while it was in Vietnam, won every major battle that it engaged in. However, Ho Chi Minh famously said, we were willing to lose the war longer than you were willing to win it. Basically, they had been fighting for their independence since they were a French colony, and the war with the United States was just the latest chapter in a war that they had been fighting for generations. And so we were going to have a tough time, no matter what. Here you can see, South Vietnam, North Vietnam. One of the major issues that the United States runs into is that the North Vietnamese were running supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other trade routes. Basically, they were able to get supplies and men and material through Cambodia and Laos into South Vietnam, while the United States was just exclusively fighting in South Vietnam. Although under Nixon, there is a bombing campaign in Cambodia. Hanoi in Operation Linebacker is bombed pretty heavily too. It still doesn't produce the desired results, and eventually North Vietnam is able to invade and take over South Vietnam. So the Cold War by the 1980s takes a dramatic turn. So the Soviet Union was embroiled in a kind of disastrous war in Afghanistan. Basically, it was like their version of Vietnam. We were backing the Mujahideen and really making the Russians sort of pay a price for what they did to us in Vietnam. They had a major nuclear incident at Chernobyl. The Russian economy was really struggling to keep up because the United States economy was much, much larger And essentially, we were able to shovel money into the fire faster than they could. So, for example, Ronald Reagan spent a ton of money on Star Wars, the Satellite Defense Initiative, basically a network of satellites that could supposedly shoot down nuclear missiles. The technology to do it didn't exist back then, but it didn't matter. It was really expensive. And in an arms race, if I build it, you have to. So the Soviets are just getting crushed economically. And then along comes Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev is willing to rule by love instead of fear. So he introduces a number of reforms. One of them is glasnost, which means openness. As in, maybe we should listen to the Soviet people and try to give them what they want. And so what ends up happening is a lot of the repressive policies about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, go away. And so people can speak, they can publish things, they can speak their minds. And for the first time, Russians are able to criticize their government. And Gorbachev is willing to listen. He's willing to rule by love instead of fear. And then he introduces perestroika, which is restructuring, as in a restructuring of the Soviet economy. And he says, you know, we've tried communism for a while. It's not working. You know, the Soviet people deserve better. So let's allow some free market capitalist practices in the Soviet Union. And so you see for the first time, businesses, things start to open up. He's communicating with Ronald Reagan about government and economics. And so at the same time, Ronald Reagan is sort of pressuring the Soviets. You have a Soviet leader who is, for the first time, willing to let communism fail. You know, from Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, all the previous Soviet leaders had maintained communism through force. Gorbachev's going to let it fail, if that's what it comes down to. Mikhail Gorbachev ends up getting a Nobel Peace Prize because of his willingness to rule by love instead of fear. All right. So in 1989, communism completely failed as an economic system in the Soviet Union and elsewhere due to the following. All right. So Eastern Europe, starting with Poland, abandons communism. Now, if this had been Stalin, he would have sent in the Red Army. He would have been like, no way, Poland, you're going to be communist whether you like it or not. Khrushchev's not like that. The Berlin Wall comes down almost by accident. So basically, like a apparatchik, basically like an East German communist sort of party member, sort of gets confused and mistakenly says that the checkpoints in the Berlin Wall are open, even though they weren't really supposed to be. And so the East and West Germans, many of whom are family members, by the way, brothers, sisters, moms, dads, you know, sons and daughters, all come out and start crossing through the checkpoints and embracing family members they haven't seen in decades. And pretty soon the whole city is out. It's in the middle of the night. They start to attack the wall basically with sledgehammers, pickaxes, and earth-moving equipment, while Soviet officers just sort of stand there and let them do it. And the Berlin Wall comes down in this very momentous kind of occasion that really signifies the end of communism. Gorbachev, you know, sleeps through it. They wake him up the next day, they tell him what's happened, and he says, well, it sounds like you guys did the right thing. So that's Gorbachev's feeling on it. Nationalism grows in the Warsaw Pact countries. They don't want to be satellite states anymore. So they're going to throw off the yoke of Soviet communism and become independent. The Soviet economy, exhausted from trying to keep up with the United States in terms of military technology, exhausted from constant conflict and war in Afghanistan, collapses. The Soviet Union breaks up and NATO expands. These are factors driving the fall of communism. Here you can see just, you know, Soviet soldiers kind of watching as Germans just take out their frustrations on what is this. It's a monument. It's not even a wall anymore at this point because they can go right around through the checkpoint. but it's a monument of oppression. And so they're literally just taking out decades of frustration against it physically. This is really one of those kind of watershed moments in history where you just know, like, wow, yeah, there's been a big shift. Something big is about to happen when you see this going on. All right, so in 1990, Germany reunifies. East and West Germany reunite into one Germany. All right, so the end of the Soviet Union comes in 1991. The USSR breaks up into 15 separate countries. I'm not going to list them all out here for you, but these are all the separate countries that the Soviet Union breaks up into. These are, Central Asian states, East Asian states, some Southern European countries. All right, let's look at the Chinese Revolution. So just kind of winding it back a little bit, remember that Japanese occupation of European colonies in Asia increased demands for independence after World War II. After World War II, the U.S. pursued a policy of containment against communism, and that included the development of regional alliances against Soviet and Chinese aggression. The Cold War led to armed conflict in Korea and Vietnam. We talked about that. After World War I, you had Chinese nationalists who overthrew the Qing Dynasty in China and started a new republic. I need to get a different color pen. I love a nice blue. They started a new republic. Japan invaded and occupied part of China during World War II. All right, and so you basically had Japanese and the Japanese invasion in the midst of a Chinese civil war, because Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were fighting Chinese communists under Mao Zedong to determine who was going to be the new kind of leader of China. Well, they sort of put aside their differences. Mostly, they still continued to fight each other a little bit, but they had a bigger threat. All right, so they're going to work together to oust the Japanese. Once the Japanese are out, ultimately the communists under Mao are going to win, and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek will be exiled into what is today called Taiwan. It calls itself the Republic of China. Japan looks at it as a wayward state, and Taiwan continues to be a little bit of a point of contention. So the communists were led by Mao Zedong and aided by the Soviet Union. The nationalists were led by Chiang Kai-shek, all right, and wanted a democracy. The peasants and lower classes supported the communist promise of land, while middle and upper class bankers and business owners supported democracy and nationalists. And so the Civil War went on until World War II, when the Japanese invaded, and the larger threat was the Japanese invasion. So after World War II, when the Japanese were gone, the war resumed. And eventually, the communists under Mao, who were in the north, continued to fight the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek in the south. Northern China, supported by the Soviet Union, wanted national liberation. They had strong public support. They were experienced in guerrilla tactics. They had Mao as their leader. And remember, the nationalists are in southern China. They end up on the island of Taiwan. They're supported by the United States, and they wanted to defeat the communists. They didn't have very much public support because of inflation and a failing economy. So there was an ineffective military, corrupt leadership, low morale. So things did not work out. All right. In 1949, Mao gained control of the country and established the People's Republic of China. The nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek had to flee to Taiwan and set up a separate government, which the Chinese still claims is theirs. Okay, so Chinese communism is a little different from Soviet communism. Mao seized farmland, redistributed it to a larger percent of the population in collective farms, and business was gradually brought under government with successive 5-year plans. So it's not quite the same as in the Soviet Union. It ends up being kind of a disaster, though, because Mao wants to kind of speed along the industrialization of his largely agricultural country. And if you tell the most populous nation on earth to melt down their farm implements and make steel, it's going to be bad. And the conservative estimates are in the tens of millions. Over 30 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. There are reports of cannibalism, terrible things happening during the Great Leap Forward. People lived in communal dorms, had communal dining rooms, etc. There was no incentive for workers, and the Great Leap Forward was a major failure and a famine that killed over 30 million people. All right. So the idea was, hey, melt down your farm implements and make steel. Did not work out that way. All right. So the Cultural Revolution in China was basically a war against supposed enemies of the people. So basically, if you were an intellectual or an artist or something like that, you were viewed as an enemy of the people. And the Red Guards wanted to make sure that all peasants and workers were equal in any way. So only literature and art that glorified the life of the common peasant was allowed. Colleges were shut down. Intellectuals were killed in large numbers. Media outlets were stopped. They basically wanted to purify the upper classes and educated folks of anyone who was viewed as an enemy, quote unquote, of the people. Thousands of people were killed in the Cultural Revolution. Factories and farms had to be shut down. Mao ended the revolution because it threatened to rip China apart in civil war. Eventually, the United States, under Nixon, normalizes relations with China. Nixon famously visits China and establishes normal relations with China. So, and China today, there's still a communist party, but they are definitely a capitalist economy. Anyway, this concludes our Cold War lecture. Make sure you guys do the discussion board, fill out those guided notes, and answer the chapter question.